Hey, do us a favor. If you like listening to the show, please just take a few minutes, not even a few minutes, 1 minute to go into Apple Podcasts and rate and review the show.
This is Random Badassery.
Okay, so our topic today is going to be an interesting topic. I think you're going to enjoy it, Lam. It's synchronicity or synchronistic events.
Huh. And we can talk about how I don't believe in that anymore.
But before we go into it, I do want to remind everybody listening that our featured charity this month is St. Jude. So please consider donating to St. Jude. There's no code, no nothing. It has nothing to do with us. We're just featuring charities that we think are doing good in the world. So please take the time and $1, even if it's just $1, and give to St. Jude. stjude.org. Okay, so where the hell? I'm doing something different this week. Instead of, the computer seems to burn my eyes when I sit in front of it for too long. So I'm going to try to do my notes this week from the iPad. See how that works. Shouldn't be too different, right?
Yeah, I was going to say, a screen's a screen's a screen. I don't know how different that's going to be for you.
For some reason, the iPad does not hurt my retina.
Weird.
Yeah, it might be the screen protector that I have on here, which is kind of a matte screen protector, so it diffuses some of the light. Plus, I have the brightness turned down to like 15%.
That'll do it. Yeah, I have my phone brightness turned down quite significantly too as well, because I live on my phone, unfortunately, for better or for worse, especially with the new job developments that are happening on my side. So like I essentially live on my phone. So I have headaches constantly now, and I got to figure out a way to, I'm going to try those computer or screen glasses and see if they have any profound effect.
Yeah, I can, obviously it depends on what monitor you have and everything, but this monitor, I don't know if it's just this one. Every time I sit down and edit an episode, I get up. Number one, my heart rate is like through the roof. Mm-hmm. And then my eyes are just killing me.
Whoa, weird.
And when I record episodes, I started noticing it too. So I'm like, no, let's try something different.
Yeah, it's crazy that it's that pronounced though. Like I don't get that profound of an effect.
Yeah. Well, everybody's different, right?
Yeah, true.
Okay, so synchronistic events. The reason I wanted to cover synchronistic events is, number one, we've talked about it before, but, like you and I have mentioned before that, especially on the show, I've mentioned this, I should say, that how many times I'm listening to something, and usually a podcast, and all of a sudden there's some synchronicity.
Sure.
So I started asking myself, thinking about this, I'm like, okay, how rare are these things? Obviously there's no synchronicity to if you're watching a Giants game and you live in the Bay Area and you go somewhere and somebody's wearing a Giants hat. Mm-hmm. That's like a 0 on the synchronicity scale, right?
Sure.
Like that is not synchronistic at all. So what I started doing is I started logging events, but they had to reach a certain level where I'm like, okay, that's weird in the sense that that's rare. And so for the last 2 months, I've been logging any, I would say if we're scaling out of 10, anything a 5 or above on the synchronicity scale. Because I wanted to see, just, okay, let's, science is about observation, right? That's the first and foremost thing is observation. Not that I'm a scientist. So I do have a bunch of events to share with you, but go ahead. You were going to say something.
Now let's go through your events first. I have beliefs on synchronicity now that are very different, and it's a very practical approach to synchronicity. And I'm not sure how it reconciles with what you're talking about.
We'll find out. That's the whole point of conversation. All right. How many of them are there? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of them. These are the ones that I found worth sharing, and I think I ordered them in increasing strangeness. So the first, some of them will be borderline mundane. So first of all, there was a conversation you and I had on a podcast at one point about Napster and Lars Ulrich. You remember that conversation?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And the next episode of Joe Rogan that I listened to, Maynard from Tool was the guest, and they mentioned Napster and Tool. I mean, Napster and Lars Ulrich.
Lars Ulrich, yeah.
Why is that higher on the level for the people listening? Because probably the last time that I thought of Napster and Lars Ulrich was probably years ago.
Sure.
At least in the context of the two of them together.
Mm-hmm.
So that was kind of strange, I thought. So that qualified. Next one. I was listening to a 2015 episode of Astonishing Legends, and which is a podcast. A lot of these are going to revolve around podcasts. I listen to a lot of podcasts. And in the episode, they mentioned the difference between Zoltar and Zoltan machines. Do you know what these are?
No, I have no idea what that is.
Do you remember Big?
I do.
Do you remember the machine?
Yes, and I do know exactly what you're talking about.
That's a Zoltan machine.
Okay.
There's also another one called Zoltar. I didn't know this until I was listening to this 4-year-old episode of a show that I like. And so and it wasn't even a long conversation. They just said that there were people who were buying Zoltar machines, I think, I might be getting it backwards, buying Zoltar machines on eBay and then getting them and realizing they wanted a Zoltan. Because they're all trying to get, because of Big, they all want Zoltan, right?
Yeah.
A few minutes later, I'm listening to this, and they move on to a couple topics, and I have to pee. I get up, I walk in the other room, I come back from the bathroom, I'm walking past the television, and there's a commercial on TV with a Zoltar machine in it.
What the hell?
That's weird, right?
That is really weird. I mean, what are the chances?
Okay, I'm glad that you agree with me that these are weird. Because I was
that is definitely strange, because that's just specific enough that that's very strange.
Yeah, I tried to be stringent with these. I didn't want to have loosey-goosey ones where people, I mean, obviously there are multiple reasons that these things can happen, and I'm not even saying what synchronistic events actually are. I'm just saying these things happened. Okay, another one in an episode with Tom. Randomly, he said something about like peanut butter on your hamburger, and I don't know why.
First of all, disgusting. Carry on.
The first thing that popped in my head was Fuddruckers. I have never been to a Fuddruckers. I don't know if they have hamburgers with peanut butter, but I said it in the episode. I said, "Oh, like Fuddruckers has that," and Tom was like, "I don't know. Do they?" I'm like, "Well, actually, I have no clue. I've never been to one. Don't know why it popped in my head. Weird, right?"
That is so random. Yeah.
So a couple days later, I'm sitting in front of the TV, and on the Apple TV, you can like browse through movies, and I'm browsing through movies, and I see Idiocracy, and I'm like, dude, I haven't seen that in a long time, probably like 6 or 7 years. And I know now that Dax Shepard is in it. But when I watched it originally, I had no idea who Dax Shepard was.
Sure.
So I'm like, oh, I'm going to watch it again now that I know who he is. Let's see how he does in this movie. And so I rewatched it, and anybody seen Idiocracy? It's a comedy, but it's not like enrapturing. So at certain points, I was looking down, doing shit on my phone while I'm watching it, and I look up at the screen, and someone's hammering a giant sign into the dirt that says Fuddruckers.
Whoa.
That's strange.
How does this shit happen in your life? I don't understand.
I don't know, but like I said, these get increasingly weird. Okay. I listened to so some of these are written at the time that they happened. This didn't just happen yesterday. I listened to the most recent episode of Strong Songs, and it's about cartoon theme songs. He covers 5 theme songs in that episode, and I think the 4th one is DuckTales. And I haven't thought about DuckTales since I was probably like 15. And it got me like hearing the song, and I was like, dude, first thing I thought was that new Disney streaming's coming. I hope they put DuckTales on there, because I would like to go back and watch that, because I used to love that cartoon.
Mm-hmm.
And then a few days later, a new episode of Wizard and Bruiser comes out. And what is that episode about? DuckTales.
Oh, so weird.
What are the chances?
If I had examples of this in my own life, I believe more in synchronicity, because you have some of the weirdest shit. That makes no sense. But I guess that's why you would. Like I said, if I had shit like this happening in my life, I would believe in synchronicity. I totally would
say that the next 4 are the strongest, and obviously the last one is the strongest. So my mom and I decided to take latte. I wrote Latter, ladder. Take latte to the beach for my birthday, and it was his first time at the beach. And we went to Santa Cruz. And as we were passing through Scotts Valley, we used to live over there. As we were passing through Scotts Valley, my mom reminisced about taking me as a little kid to Santa's Village. And for anybody that doesn't know, Santa's Village was like exactly what it sounded like. It was a place where you took kids and they had reindeer and you could sit on Santa's lap. And it was in Scotts Valley. And it looked like it was, it was part of the woods, right? And it's been closed since, I think, like early 80s, somewhere in there. It's not even there anymore. Like there's a giant building over the spot and everything. So anyways, talking about that, a few days later, I'm binging a true crime podcast called Bear Brook. And in one of the episodes, I'm listening and they said, and then the suspect was found living in a trailer park in Scotts Valley and something Santa's Village. And I'm like, what? And then all of a sudden they played a fucking vintage, 1970 radio commercial for Santa's Village.
Oh, creepy. Oh, that's really weird.
That's
just bizarre.
It's strange. Like you wonder why I want to talk about synchronicity is because this shit happens to me all the time.
I don't understand your life.
Okay, so did you see those puzzle paintings that Drew was doing, where you had to like solve the mystery of the painting?
Oh yeah. They were kind of infuriating. Yeah, I remember those.
Yeah. So I was looking at one of them, and I'm like, trying to figure it out or whatever, and I'm looking at it. I'm like, there's that cartoon girl in one of them.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I know her, but I can't place who she is. It's an old time comic strip character, black and white comic strip, and I can't place the name, right? So I start searching around the internet, and finally I find out it's Nancy.
Yeah,
the character's name is Nancy. The next morning, I'm listening to an old episode of Flophouse, which is a show where these guys talk about movies and kind of make fun of a movie. And they're talking about the Justice League movie. And in the middle of the episode, somebody makes a joke about classic comic strips and says, quote, "Time to catch up on the adventures of Nancy and Sluggo."
Dude.
Okay, now these two, those were weird. But these two are next level because they're two parts.
Huh. Okay.
Those are all one synchronicity. This is a synchronicity that happens twice. And I'm not sure, actually, now that I'm looking at both of them, I'm not sure which one's weirder. Oh, actually, there's one more. One more single one. See, this is the problem with the iPad. So I've been slowly working my way through an anime called One Piece.
Mm-hmm.
And One Piece it's still on the air. It's been on the air since 1999. There are, I think, somewhere near 900 episodes.
Jeez.
So I've been watching the show for years.
Mm-hmm.
Lately I've been watching it more and more, but for a while there, I'd only watch a couple episodes every few months or something like that. So about, I think 2 weeks ago, I'm about 275 episodes in. And for some reason, I decided, you know what? Maybe I know what it is, because I was getting impatient, because sometimes they drag things out in the cartoon. Like commercial break, and you're like,
mm-hmm.
Fuck. And then when they come back from the commercial break, they show you the last like 40 seconds of what happened before the commercial break. So I decided, You know what? I'm going to read the fucking mangas. I've never read a manga before. I'm going to download the manga on my Kindle, and I'm going to read the manga. So I download the manga. It's obviously, I download the first one. Actually, no, I didn't get it on my Kindle. I downloaded and became a subscriber to Shonen Jump, so I can have access to all of them. And so I read the first issue. And in the first issue, it's the origin story of the main character, Monkey D. Luffy. It shows how he got his powers, and when he's a little kid, how he got his hat. And as I'm watching it, or as I'm reading it, I'm realizing, I'm like, did they? It's been a long time since I saw the beginning of this cartoon, but they didn't cover this at the beginning of the cartoon. Like I said, I'm 270 episodes in. It's like way far past this.
Yeah.
I'm like, that's weird. I wonder why they didn't put it in the cartoon. The next day, I sit down to watch the show. I get 4 episodes in, and there's a whole episode that's a flashback of the exact story I just read the day before. Like exact. I literally had the manga open in front of me while I was watching the episode and noticing the differences where I'm like, okay, this is like 80% they left out. Okay, they left out a little bit of violence there. That person died. They didn't do it in the cartoon, but I'd never.
That is bizarre.
Yeah. Okay. Now the next level ones. Hopefully everybody's still with us on this. We're going to talk about this more. There'll be more discussion. Please stick with us. Yeah, I don't know which of these is weirder now that I'm looking at the two of them. So back to Strong Songs, the podcast. He did an episode where he broke down 2 Elton John songs, Tiny Dancer and Goodbye Yellow Brick Road. Great episode. A few hours after I listened to it, I had to go to the grocery store. I got in the car and got to the end of the block and realized that I was listening to the radio and it was Goodbye Yellow Brick Road on the radio.
Huh.
I got to the store, which is only a few blocks away. So I got out of the car before the song's even over. And I walked into the grocery store and Tiny Dancer was playing.
Whoa, weird.
That one's fucking weird. To the point,
that's
like
weird. Yeah.
The Goodbye Yellow Brick Road, I was like, that's funny. That's, like, yeah, okay, it's possible. It's kind of, But when the other song is playing in the grocery store from the episode, that just kind of knocked me back pretty far.
Yeah, that's bizarre.
Okay. And what I think is, at least when I made this list, what I thought was the strongest one. So I've just finished reading Tara Westover's memoir, Educated.
Mm-hmm.
Fantastic book. And I enjoyed it so much. Like, she goes through a lot. I don't want to tell the whole story of her book or anything, but she goes through a lot in that book. And you have an affection for her by the time you get to the end of the book, because she basically has to walk away from her whole life because she grew up with these government hating Mormon family.
Mm-hmm.
And so they all think she's the devil, or not all of them, but her parents think she's the devil. So anyways, I had this affection for her at the end of it. And I'm like, you know what? I know that Oprah loved this book and all these people, it's a bestseller. I bet you she's been interviewed on a podcast. I just want to listen to a couple interviews with her. I want to hear what her voice sounds like, and maybe she'll tell me more about the book or whatever, or what's happened. To know
the person, yeah.
Yeah, or what's happened since the book, because you write this book about your expose about your family. They're probably going to be pissed off. So I find a couple of them and download them. And the first one I start with is the book review podcast. So I start playing it and I'm listening to it. And while I'm listening to it, I have some of my old notebooks out, and I've been going through my old notebooks. And when I'm reading books or anything and I encounter a movie I haven't seen that I want to see, or that sounds interesting, or a book or something like that, I always write it in my notebooks.
Mm-hmm.
So I was going through and collecting those things, make a list, like a queue of things to check out. And while I'm listening, flipping through, and I see one, and it just says, usually when I write down a book, I wrote down the title of the book and then the author. But I had just written down The Glass Castle. So I was like, what is that? Like, is that a book? Is that a movie? So still listening to the podcast, I flip over and I'm in Google and I'm doing a search, Glass Castle. Turns out it's a book. It's actually a memoir, and it's a memoir by this woman named Jeanette Walls. Okay, so I write down on the list, The Glass Castle by Jeanette Walls. And then I carry on down through the rest of the old notebook page, still listening to the podcast, get to the bottom of the page. I turn the page and Tara Westover says, The Glass Castle by Jeanette Walls.
Whoa.
Okay.
That one's weirder. That one's definitely weirder, dude.
Okay, but hold on. It's not done.
Oh, Jesus. Okay.
2 days later, I went on a walk, and what I've been doing, I told you to get rid of the paper books that I've been putting them in those little libraries for people to take and read. So what I've been doing lately is just kind of like a farmer going around checking my crops. I go and check and see if the books I'm putting in there are being taken. And I go, but there's only one on the walk I was on that day. And I open it up. What's in there? The Glass Castle by Jeanette Walls.
What? What?
Okay, that's all the events. Would you agree those are strange?
Yeah, those are pretty weird. I mean, that last one's weird because it's multi-staged, and I think the multiple stage thing is what makes it even more bizarre.
Mm-hmm.
And that they don't take place in a short span of time. It's over a few days.
Yeah, it's the, like one thing happening statistically more possible than that 2-stage thing.
Yeah, sure.
When it happens twice, just like the song thing, like, okay, statistics of me hearing Goodbye Yellowbrook Road after hearing a podcast about it, not insane.
Mm-hmm.
Weird, but not insane.
Sure.
It may not even be a 5. It might have been a 4.
Sure.
But then the other song playing inside the grocery store, that's like an 8.
Yeah, you throw in Tiny Dancer on top of that, and now shit gets weird.
Yeah.
And not only that, but like back to back. It wasn't even like it was the same day. It was in the same trip.
Mm-hmm. So
yeah,
before I continue with all the other stuff I have prepped, you prep something and you should follow up on that now. You're saying that you had something to say about synchronicity.
Yeah, and maybe it's just my need to have more control, like some self-actualization in my own life. But I no longer prescribe to the idea that synchronous things happen. I think things just happen, or at least that's where I'm headed towards right now. I mean, you give compelling evidence to the contrary, obviously, but I don't know, man. I feel like it's a manifest destiny point in my life, and so because of that, like I try to remove myself from any possibility of coincidence or providence leading me to a certain path in life. You know.
Well, I should clarify something to the listeners from my perspective. I'm not saying what I believe synchronicities are or what you should do with them. I'm just saying it's a fact that they happen.
Sure.
It is a fact that synchronistic events happen. Yeah, just like it's a fact that coincidence happens, right?
Yeah, that shit is fucking uncanny, man. That's bizarre.
So what I actually, because I don't literally have no idea, like what, if this is, it is something that happens. If it is something more than just probability that's at play here, which some of these question, just these events. I mean, there's probably grander examples in other people's lives, but just in the last 2 months, at least those two push the boundary of probability. Where you're like, statistically, that's insane. So what I did is I read a book, and I read a book called Synchronicity, The Art of Coincidence, Choice, and Unlocking Your Mind by Dr. Kirby Surprise, which is a fascinating name.
That can't be right.
That's his real name.
Huh.
And what's really interesting about this book is I picked this up. If you could see the cover, it looks like the type of book, like a woo-woo book, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I really thought that this was going to be. And I was in for that because I also have queued up. I think this is going to end up being a 2-part episode in a way, because I do want to read Jung's book on synchronicity, since he's the one that coined the phrase.
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't do that for this episode. And this is already 2 months of work. So I read this book, and one of the things that I found most fascinating before we even get into any of his ideas and theories is he talks in here about that his explanations for things. He says straight up, they probably aren't true. He says they're probably fictions. He says, but they're useful. Just because something's a fiction doesn't mean you can't use that fiction to your advantage.
Sure.
And he calls those explanatory fictions or useful fictions. So I thought that was really interesting. So he's like, I don't know if this is true. He's like, but this is what I like to think. And I like that. This guy he's a psychologist. I should clarify that. So he deals with, what's that?
Do you though?
Do I what?
Because I feel like, do you like that though? Explanatory fictions?
Yes, absolutely.
I don't.
Absolutely.
I'm the opposite. I think they're inherently dangerous.
You use them every day. We all do.
Well, I understand, but like in an analogous way in which we know that the fiction is not true.
But if you know it's a useful fiction, you use the word fiction, you know it's not true.
Well, I understand
it's inherent in the definition.
But where it becomes cloudy is when you take the thing that is supposed to be inherently true, and different people have perceptions as to whether they're true or not.
No, you're confusing it with subjective truth.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Maybe. I mean, then I guess for the sake of clarity, I need that hashed out as an idea, because
subjective truth is
to things like religion now, and that's an explanatory fiction.
Well, subjective. No, it isn't. It should be. but people use it as truth.
And that's what I'm saying. Like where
But
the perception.
if you say
of
it's fiction, it's false.
Okay. So if we're defining it that way, sure, that makes sense.
Like, for example, if I think, if I'm Wayne Gretzky and I think that tucking in one side of my jersey makes me a better hockey player, and because of that confidence, I play better, that's a useful fiction. Even though I'm a logical human being and I know that there is no providence out there that's worried about where I tuck my shirt. But I do it anyways. Why? Because it makes me confident to play.
Not sure if I buy that. Still
it's
not
a
sure.
Useful fiction.
I guess.
We use them every day. Everything.
I suppose. I don't know. I mean, I make it. I mean, in my mind, that makes it akin to superstition, and I'm the least superstitious person you'll ever meet.
Yeah, but the difference between a superstition and a useful fiction is, once again, superstition purports itself to be truth. A fiction is aware that it's false.
That's a real dicey line, though. How many people have enough self-awareness to be aware of the fact that their useful fictions are actually not true?
Everybody. They just don't always exercise it.
Yeah, possibly.
It's built. I mean, think about this. Santa Claus, useful fiction.
Sure.
Why is
Easter Bunny, whatever. Yeah.
The parents know that Santa Claus doesn't exist, but it also helps their kids behave. Useful fiction.
Sure.
Dangerous? No.
Yeah.
Why? Because you know it's bullshit. And eventually the kids will figure it out too when they get older.
Sure.
You're not psychologically damaging them by creating a person that they find out later doesn't exist. It's a useful fiction. So the reason I like that in particular is because I like somebody going into a subject like this and not claiming to be an expert. Okay. Because he could have very easily written this book and said, here's the way shit goes. And by the way, I'm going to use science. So therefore, I'm telling you the truth. What he says is he read a bunch of books on science, and this is the best way that he can make sense of this happening. And I have to say that if synchronicities mean something more than probability, although, by the way, he doesn't say that they're free from probability, this would probably be a really good answer. And yeah. So, okay, let me start with this. Once again, useful fiction. So we're not arguing whether this is true or not. We're just arguing whether this is interesting. So he says, think of existence, and some of this comes from the ideas of Albert Einstein and E equals MC squared. And he says existence is like a sheet of paper. So all existence, everything, life, you, me, dogs, horses, trees, rocks, stars, all exist on a plane of existence, which is, think of it like a piece of paper. Now, you can draw a circle on that piece of paper and say, this is me. And you can draw a circle on the piece of paper over here and say, this is you. And you can draw a circle over here and say, this is a horse, and this is Latte, and this is Tom, and this is my house. And you can draw whatever you want on that sheet of paper. But no matter what, everything's still connected because the paper is still there. So along that lines, time and space are also one. That's Einstein. Time and space. He doesn't call it time and space. He calls it time-space.
Or space-time, yeah.
Now, because everything is connected, and because the human mind is meant for pattern recognition, we see instances of this interconnectedness of everything. And those are synchronicities. So, for example, why does this happen? Well, why wouldn't it happen? Because you're connected to it. Why wouldn't it be there? Because you're connected to it. You're connected to everything. So that's the basic backdrop of his theory. But he goes into far, far deeper. So we'll stop there for now. Does that make sense? Did I explain it in a way that makes sense?
It does make sense. I still don't entirely buy it.
I'm not asking you if you buy it. It's a useful fiction. I'm asking you if it's interesting.
Oh, yeah.
Once again, there's no way we can know whether these things are true. So we can't argue truth here. We're arguing interesting and ramifications if it's true.
I can't. I think it's a very specific place I am in my head. I don't think I can accept the interesting. I can't accept it as interesting.
Okay, well then I'll just keep telling you about it. Well, we can't. If you can't accept the premise of that, then we can't discuss it. So then we'll move past it.
Well, I mean, it's not that I can't. It's tough because I think there was a period of my life, and actually not too long ago, where I would have totally bought the premise.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure I'm understanding why you have a problem with fiction. I still think you're conflating it with truth.
It's possible. Maybe I can't get past that instance.
Okay, could we have a conversation about a fictional character?
Yeah, of course.
You know that fictional character is not real.
Yeah, of course.
Do you learn lessons from books?
Yeah.
Useful fiction.
Okay. Yeah, I see what you mean.
So this might not be true. It's probably not true because who the hell would be able to guess something this complex?
Sure.
But
okay, I see what you mean.
What's useful about it? Or is there something useful about it?
I don't know. Is this a theory on the universe that you find useful for yourself?
I'm probably going to have to tell you more before I can really say that, because the rest, when I get to the end, yes, I did. Okay. I found it surprisingly useful. So first of all, picking up this woo-woo book, or I thought was going to be a woo-woo book, which maybe sometimes feels like one because he is saying some strange stuff at points, but once again, he's saying it's fiction. But I did not expect picking up this book that he would be able to explain string theory to me and have it make sense. Because I've heard a lot of stuff about string theory and it's never made sense to me before.
Oh, this should be good. I'm kind of obsessed with string theory.
His explanation, now once again, he says there's multiple versions of string theory, but his explanation of string theory, all of a sudden I was like, oh, I get it. Just it's not expansive and everything, but it's just, here's the basics.
Sure.
So here's how he explains it. First of all, subatomic particles are loops of energy. And they vibrate like guitar strings, hence the name strings in string theory. The way that they vibrate determines what kind of particle they appear to be to us, whether they appear to be a proton, a neutron, or whatever, depends on how they are vibrating. One theory posits that strings are sewn through time-space like needles and thread through a flat cloth. Now, why that is really interesting to me is because he's saying that in order for strings to exist, they have to exist more than on the physical plane, more than the 4 dimensions that we know, which are width, length, depth, and time. They have to exist beyond that. Just like, so going back to that piece of paper, if everything we know exists in dimensions that, in this sense, can be represented by a piece of paper. So all it has is length and width. Technically it has depth, but we'll leave that out. We'll just pretend like it doesn't have depth. In order for a string to go through that cloth or piece of paper, the string has to be able to go up and down, right?
Yep.
But in a universe that only has length and width, there is no up and down.
Yep.
So therefore, the string must exist in dimensions that aren't on that plane. And in the same way, our dimension only has 4 that we know of, or our plane of existence only has 4 dimensions. But the string, in order to thread itself through time-space, has to exist in more dimensions. And some say there may be as many as 11 dimensions.
Or 16, depending on which version of string theory you prescribe to, sure.
Yeah, exactly. Like I said, there's tons and tons of different theories on this because, once again, they're trying to figure this shit out. So I thought that was a really good explanation. I'm like, oh, okay, I get the more dimension thing now. I can't imagine those other dimensions because they're beyond me, but I understand why they have to exist. Now, one version of, I think he ends up using both of these, but one version is the M theory. And M theory is about M space. And essentially the theory of M space, according to Dr. Kirby, is that when the Big Bang happened, we exploded out like a bubble, a bubble of time space. Now you're thinking like we're inside the bubble, but we're not. We're on the surface of the bubble. So everything in our 4 dimensions exists on the membrane that is the surface of the bubble. But there is dimensions beyond that which exist inside the bubble. that is M space. I believe the space outside the bubble also counts as M space.
Mm-hmm.
There's also
the point is that it's not on the surface of the bubble.
Yeah, and some people argue that there's these things I didn't have time to look this up, but there's these things called brains, floating brains in M space, and when they collide, that's what causes these explosions. I don't know what they are. I think they're I don't know what they are, to be honest. So there's another theory which doesn't necessarily say that M theory is not true, but it's called N theory. And N theory is one that I've talked about before. I just didn't know it was called that. Is that every possibility exists.
Mm-hmm.
That there are infinite possibilities for every action, and for each of those, there's a universe.
Yep.
So there's a universe where I didn't say that.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a universe where I said more than that. And there's a universe where a plane crashed into my house. And there's a universe where I died as a baby. All of these universe exists simultaneously.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where it's very interesting, because he says that just as we move through time and space, it's possible that we are also moving through probability.
Sure.
That these different versions of ourselves are not actually different versions of ourselves. We are all of them. Mm-hmm. And we're existing in all of those realities at the same time, which is what makes a synchronicity possible. Because probability becomes something that can be played with, in the sense that because you exist in all of those, a crossover between them can happen. Which he does go into, like, how you could go through that stuff. I'm not interested in that. But I do find the idea that a synchronicity is something that is being connected through M space very interesting. And that it also has something to do with the possibilities. So if, let me articulate that a little bit better. If you were to imagine that we are on the surface of this bubble, and that there's also N space, so there's infinite possibilities. So that membrane is so thin that all those infinite possibilities can exist as the same membrane. They're layers, right?
Okay.
So if a string can thread through one plane of existence, theoretically, it would thread through all of them, because they're all lined up.
They're all lined up. I'm trying to wrap my head around that sentence.
Okay. Think of it this way. If every membrane of a possible reality is a sheet of paper.
Okay. Yeah. I see what you mean.
They're a stack of papers. Mm-hmm. So if you stab through one sheet of paper, you're stabbing through all of them.
And essentially, if you're a being that exists upon one plane, you're existing in all of them simultaneously.
Exactly. Now he goes into thought. I can't remember what he calls it. Thought forms. And I didn't really buy into the thought form thing, so I left it out. But he does talk about, like, being able to pierce through those things and create thoughts. Once again, useful fiction. He has fun with it. He doesn't think it means anything. That's another thing. He doesn't think synchronicities mean anything. He says you can assign meaning to them if you want. He says, but they don't actually mean anything. He says you can make them happen, but they don't mean anything. All they do is remind you of things.
Sure. That I can get behind. That actually makes sense.
What's really interesting is he says, if all that's possible, he says, then it's theoretically possible that you can have synchronicities from the past and synchronicities from the future too.
Sure.
Because you're piercing time and space, or time-space, or space-time. You're piercing it. So
space-time.
If you're piercing space, you're piercing time. So, like, you could have, like, for example, my glass castle is a great example. If that is truly a synchronicity, I mean, it is a synchronicity, but if it is a synchronicity, the way that he explains it, then I connected the past right there, in the sense, right?
Yeah,
because
sure.
Actually twice.
Yeah.
Because I had to have written that in the notebook first. And then I had to, I'm listening to the book. So that's the present. I'm listening to the podcast about the book I just finished. That's the present. But years ago, I wrote Glass Castle down. And then somebody at the same time was probably putting that book. At the same time I was reading Tara Westover's book, somebody was probably putting the Jeanette Walls book in that little library.
Sure.
So what's fascinating is I was listening to Astonishing Legends, and they were talking about like, I enjoy some of this shit, but I'm cynical on a lot of it. But they were talking about like ghosts and all this shit. But I guess they were like this guy was telling a story. He was like in some haunted house with a EVP crew or whatever. Was that what's called EVP? Were they electronic?
EKG? I don't know.
No, electromagnetic resonance, EMR. No, I can't remember where they get the recordings of ghosts.
Yeah,
apparently,
yeah, sure.
But they were trying to do some of that stuff or whatever, and he was in this room, and they were in another room, and they could see down this hallway, and they saw him get up and do something, and then move, and there's a recording of them talking. They're like, "Where's he going?" And then he says something to them, but when he talks to them, he's still in the room. So what they saw wasn't him, according to them, right?
Uh-huh.
And I was like, oh, that's interesting. And then all of a sudden, I remembered this space-time thing, and I'm like, okay, so if you could pierce space and time, then, well, that's interesting. Was that him from the past? And then all of a sudden he goes, so the interviewer goes, he's like, so the thing that you were doing in the hallway, did you do that before? Have you done, that action that you were doing before? The person that wasn't you, maybe it was an echo. Did you do that before? And he's like, no. He's like, but I did do it later.
Huh.
Because later they tried to reenact what happened. So he ended up doing exactly what this thing that they saw did.
Well, that's weird.
And so I thought of this, and I'm like, oh, that would be, once again, I'm not purporting any of this stuff to be true, but that would be pretty fascinating if you can create an echo from the future because you can pierce space-time.
It was a friend of mine who was a physicist. We used to, this sounds dumb and odd, but we used to sit around and drink, and we used to talk about this kind of stuff because I've been fascinated with string theory and M theory and all that kind of stuff. And, Stephen, if you want a fun read or maybe the most boring read of your life, go read The Theory of Everything by Stephen Hawking. It's pretty fascinating. But some of this stuff is discussed in there. But one of the things that is discussed is this idea of multiple realities, basically an infinite number of sheets of paper being stacked on top of each other that define a very specific point in which we interact with the universe. And in the instances that I'm talking about, there's a theory that the layers of paper from one point to the next is kind of like this. How do I put this? Okay, we're getting weird on this episode.
Oh, yeah, totally.
So basically, the dimension that's added to all of this that you haven't talked about is gravity and how gravity affects it. So now imagine your sheets of paper with someone dripping water on certain pieces of it. So at points, they get thinner, and at other points, they merge entirely. Mm-hmm. And so the theory, or at least part of the theory, is that there are places in the universe, not just specifically on Earth, but just all around the universe, where the layers are much thinner, where things like what you're talking about are reported to have happened. Like, things in like there's a factory in Russia in which this happens, or like there's a textile place in Thailand in which this kind of stuff happens, where like someone will see someone that works there on camera, but then that person will be behind them and saying hello. You know what I mean? And a lot of it is chalked up to like supernatural stuff, but the people or the things that we used to discuss were, what if it wasn't supernatural? What if it really was a phenomenon, and that we were just understanding a very different side of what that phenomenon looks like, And that's so is that real then?
That's why this was appealing to me. Mm-hmm. Because it seemed like, even though he's saying it's a useful fiction because he has no idea, and nobody knows whether string theory is true.
Sure.
It hasn't been proved. But to be able to look at something like synchronicity, which people think is providence and all of these, or it's one of the things he talks about in there. He's like, one of the dangerous things about synchronicity is people think God's talking to them.
Sure.
And he's like, well, here's a test. Instead of imagining God's talking to you, why don't you just imagine Scooby-Doo for a week? He did it because he's a psychologist. He did it with a client. Sure. And the client was convinced that, he's like, people get angry when I talk about this because I'm talking about religion. He's like, but he told the client to do this. And the client came back a week later and he's like, oh my God, you're right. I'm creating it.
Sure.
And that's one of his arguments. He says all of these synchronistic events, the universe is not doing this to you. So all these things that happen to me, according to his theory, I'm doing it.
Yeah, sure. So here's the real question, right? How much do you think of this as we're setting this up subconsciously?
You mean the synchronicity?
Yeah.
Oh, well, I think if he's correct and we are actually the ones creating this, and most of us are surprised by him, then there's no other way that we could be doing it, but then subconsciously. And I think it goes back to that original thing about that sheet of paper, right? So if we are all connected in that sense, then, or there will be times where you're just going to create those wrinkles, where it's like, like if you were to put a heavy thing onto a piece of paper, it's going to dip down. Maybe when you do that, it pulls things in.
Sure.
And I want to clarify two things real quick for the audience. First of all, I know all this stuff sounds weird. Number one, that's why I want to talk about it, because that's what the show says. We talk about interesting or strange or complex topics, right?
Mm-hmm.
But one of the main reasons I want to pick this is because synchronicity is weird, but synchronicity is always given mystical connotations.
Sure.
What I found interesting about this book is somebody saying, what if it's science? Like you were saying. And even though string theory, when you get into this shit, string theory sounds like mysticism. It's actually science. It's just not proven science yet. It's theory.
Well, I mean, it's that old adage, right? Like, technology appears to be magic until science explains it otherwise.
Yeah. Arthur C. Clarke.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure I'm butchering that quote.
It's all something... all advanced forms of technology are indistinguishable from magic or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And that's part of the thing that's fascinating to me about this, is because it's like, I know this is happening because I can document these things that happen.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have meaning attached to them. Like I don't think that the universe is trying to tell me to listen to more Elton John. It might be telling me to read Jeanette Walls. I don't know, but I can assign those meanings myself, and just as as you can with a tarot card, or you can with anything in life, you can assign a meaning to it.
Sure.
As long as you're aware that you're doing that of your own volition, and there's not some invisible force telling you something. And that's what I found most fascinating about it, is him being so adamant that he's like, this is happening, but you're doing it.
Sure.
And I think that's why he has some of the weirder chapters that are in there are trying to tell you how to do it. But I think that's why he did that, because I think he thinks if he can show you how to do it and you do it, then you will understand that it's not the voice of some invisible entity.
Yeah, some omnipotent entity that's defining your existence.
Yeah, it's just you manipulating science.
Sure.
Which is, I think, a very fascinating idea. I mean, obviously, all of this is fascinating. Otherwise, I wouldn't be talking about it. But
yeah, and I mean, even from the string theory perspective, like, I mean, this is a very old interest in my life. Like, I've been interested in the practical versions of string theory, and how M theory, and I've heard a little bit about N theory, but you've explained it differently tonight than I've understood it. But I actually do, at least on some level, prescribe to the idea of M theory as being a viable explanation for how the universe works. N theory means you have infinite bubbles, so that's different. But it's still
they're not mutually exclusive, though.
Yeah, no, that's what I mean. Is like the one does not necessarily disprove the other. In fact, they actually are fairly complementary.
Right.
And so from that perspective, understanding that there's infinite layers of bubbles that define what we understand as reality, and being able to poke holes between them in order to, I guess, see or exist within all of the possibilities at once.
Well, no, you're already doing that. If you poke holes, what you're doing is just manipulating probability.
Sure. And just for everyone who's listening to this, because I may potentially be working in the political world, it's not like I believe that this is true. Just fascinating.
It's a viable scientific theory, not according to you, not according to me, according to actual scientists.
Yeah, according to people like Stephen Hawking, who is far smarter than I will ever be.
Exactly.
And his theory of everything definitely included, he didn't touch on N theory at all, but M theory was definitely a part of his version of string theory.
Yeah, I don't think N theory existed yet for him.
That may not, that sounds fairly recent. And I mean, honestly, I haven't, because I don't really have anyone to discuss quantum physics with.
Right. And by the way, neither of us are experts in this, guys. So don't come at us telling us we're wrong.
Yeah, I mean,
I'm sure we're wrong.
I mean, I've read tons of material on string theory, but I'm still not an expert. I mean, that's the space for quantum physicists, and that I'm not professing to be one at all.
I'm just totally stoked I have like a glancing understanding of it for once.
But I mean, you do explain it in such a way that I think Stephen Hawking did, which makes it far more easy to understand, because string theory as a quantitative theory for the universe is a tough one to really wrap your head around, because you're dealing with vibrations. And in a way that we don't understand vibrations, on a colloquial level. It's a very different understanding of what vibrations are. Right. So it a lot of people think that these theories are contrasting or opposing in many ways. And even the idea of string theory and how string theory works still works within our understanding of quantum mechanics. It just redefines the units of measure that we use to define those quantum mechanics.
Right. Well, the reason that a lot of this stuff, not only what we've discussed, but string theory in general, seems witchy, if I can use that word.
Witchy.
I don't know why I wanted to use that word, but the reason it seems like that is because you're trying to imagine things that you can't imagine. Like when people tell us that space is infinite, you can't imagine that, right?
Well, because we want at least without, because it takes a leap of imagination, right? Like it takes a suspension of disbelief in a sense. And so from that perspective, like you have to be able to conceive of a world beyond the dimensions that you understand. And I think that's it's not that it's tough for people to do that. It's that people don't want to do that because it makes them question the reality that they live in.
Well, I would say with certain things, it's impossible.
Well, this is why your idea of a functional fiction or a useful fiction is perfect in this circumstance, because you don't have to believe this, nor do you have to put any credence into what it is or how it defines your universe. It's just an interesting idea.
Exactly. Like any science fiction book, right? Star Trek, the chances of transporter, theoretically, yes, a transporter it's a sound theory because It's theoretically possible.
And to be real with you, N theory makes a transporter far more possible.
Yeah, exactly. But we can't make a transporter yet, right? So it doesn't exist. So therefore, it's a useful fiction, the idea of a transporter. And almost anything on Star Trek. Yeah. Those were useful fictions. And so, like, oh, that's interesting. We can talk about the transporter just like we could talk about Klingons. Mm-hmm. They don't exist, but we can talk about them because they're interesting.
Man, I so didn't think I'd be talking about string theory in this episode. I so did.
That's why I waited to use this episode for you specifically, because I know your string theory.
It's so weird because I literally haven't spoken out loud about string theory in, maybe 10 years. Because the friend that I had that I used to talk about this kind of stuff with died. And so I didn't have an outlet by which to get my physics nerdiness out with somebody. And so it's literally probably been a decade since I've discussed string theory with anybody at length.
And to clarify to the audience, one other thing I should clarify that it took me a while to wrap my head around. So when I'm talking about these infinite membranes stacking up, you might be wondering, like, okay, if I'm going to use the paper metaphor, eventually that ream gets really big, right? And you can't pierce a needle through it because it's like so many. And if you're going to stack up infinite numbers of paper, that's not, they're no longer membranes, right? It's just a block of something. You have to remember once again that only the surface is the dimensions that we have.
Yeah, only the surface has depth.
Exactly. So in order to stack these things, you're not adding depth.
Yeah.
Because you're adding it into a dimension, once again, that we can't conceptualize because it doesn't exist for us.
Well, I mean, in theory, if you're talking about N theory for what it describes, it's that all the sheets of paper occupy the exact same space.
Exactly. Theoretically, right?
Theoretically, yeah, sure.
There's a, there's a green version of me right here doing the exact same thing. It's just green.
If you want to get really crazy about this, add the dimension of time in there.
Oh, of course.
And how like I thoroughly believe now that time is linear and time can never go backwards. And so because of that, smashing that into quantum theory as we understand it, and M and N theory, radically changes how we define time, space, and gravity, and how those forces all work together. Time is a very interesting variable in all of this, and in that it's not a variable at all; it's a control.
Well, I actually think that time doesn't exist the way that we think it exists. For example, time is not constant.
Sure,
we know that for a fact.
But it is linear, at least in my mind.
Well, I think in the human mind it is linear, but I think outside of our conceptualization that it is not.
I don't agree, because I think entropy is a defined force in the universe.
Yeah, but you're talking about our universe.
Yeah, that's true.
Well, you're talking about our plane of existence.
Yeah, the rules in our universe work a very specific way. Sure.
On our membrane, that's time is linear. Yeah. But beyond that, if M space, and we'll just go with M space right now. If M space exists, time exists out there too.
Sure.
But it doesn't exist the way it does here. It's not linear there.
Yeah. The easier way to put that is it doesn't have to.
I don't think it can. In order for the things that this theory purports, I don't think that time can be linear out there. Because things have to be able to move as they move in order to thread through.
So I agree with the idea that time is not a constant necessarily,
provable fact.
But I do. Yeah, exactly. Like, I mean, fly a plane around in orbit.
Exactly. That was the example I was going to use.
Yeah. Or
explain that to the audience first before you move on.
Well, basically, the further and further, if you're taking it from a physics perspective, the further you go from a gravity well, the slower time acts upon you.
Go a little simpler than that.
So if you fly a plane at altitude and you have a watch on that's synced to a clock somewhere on Earth, less time will have passed in the plane than it will have on the planet.
Yeah, because you're moving in different. I guess technically you're moving at a different rate of time.
Yeah, and the best explanation we have thus far for that is gravity and how its effect on time defines time itself. So, and for example,
by the way, it's minuscule differences in time.
It's microscopic. I mean, don't get me wrong. Like, if we're talking about real changes in that constant, then we're talking about traveling closer and closer to the speed of light. Basically, the faster to the speed of light you go and the further away from a gravity well you are, the slower time will be to you relative to the rest of the universe. This is not to say that you somehow slow down. You still feel like time is moving at a constant, but to the rest of the universe, you are moving infinitely slower.
Yeah, you're just moving through time differently.
Yeah, this is what I mean. Interstellar tried to explain that a little bit by having a planet really close to a black hole and then having the time pass differently from the probe that was outside of the planet to the planet itself. I think it was like 1 hour was like 7 years or something like that. And that's a really rudimentary way to put it, but I definitely do think that, like if we're explaining it that way, things closer to the singularity of a black hole have a tendency to move at a very different speed.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't think it was this book. I think it was something else that I was listening to. I finally also, we'll call this minute astrophysics. I finally understand how black holes are made. Mm-hmm. I didn't get it before.
Sure.
Because everybody explains it too complicated. I need it taken down to the simple and then tell me more complicated after I get the basic principle. And the basic principle, from what I understood from this one person explaining, is that a star is so large and has so much gravity that when it explodes, it doesn't explode.
Yeah.
Because it can't escape its own gravity.
That's right.
So instead of blowing out, it blows into a black hole.
Yep.
So it's kind of like implosion.
Yep.
But different. And what's also fascinating, that makes Event Horizon such a more interesting movie.
Oh, Event Horizon. Wow. One of the best horror movies ever made. Mm-hmm. I find it great. Plus the performances are fantastic. I love Lawrence Fishburne. So, I mean, it's one of my favorite movies of all time. When I got rid of most of my DVDs, I think I have like 40 left. Event Horizon was definitely one of those that I kept. Because it defines a lot of what we're talking about. Like even the way Dr. Weir explains where the ship went and how is essentially N3.
Right. And actually, just briefly, do you want to explain in like a sentence or two what an event horizon is? Since we brought it up.
Oh, I'd have to look that up. I don't know how to
So
define it.
if I could be wrong, I'm going to guess here because I'm pretty sure I understand it. I believe an event horizon is the point that you can no longer pass because of time. So if you're going into a black hole, time slows down as you get closer and closer to the source of gravity because the gravity is stronger than time.
Well, time slows down relative to the rest of the universe. You still think that time is operating at a normal speed.
Right.
So it's because of that relative.
Because of that, you never pass the event horizon because there's a point where time becomes so incremental that you never move past it. Mm-hmm. So you never actually go into a black hole.
This is all theoretical, by the way. No one will ever get close enough to one to not be completely.
I mean, we just barely
at the atomic level.
We just barely got the first picture of one ever.
Sure, yeah, and we're not even quite sure if it is what it is yet.
Yeah, could just be a big space butthole.
Wait till you start. Oh, here's a crazy rabbit hole for you to dive down. Start looking at the giant voids in space.
I don't know if I'm ready for that yet.
Terrifying. There are vast portions of the known universe that are completely devoid of any matter.
That's hard to imagine, isn't it? But
and they're like hundreds, sometimes thousands of light years across, and that is absolutely terrifying.
It's kind of neat, though.
Yeah, it is. Of course, it's neat. Yeah, but I mean, this is the kind of stuff that keeps me up at night. So if you wonder what I think about at 3 a.m, it's stuff like this. And yeah, like I think a year ago, I started to think about these vast voids in space, and there's some really fascinating articles about them, and trying to understand what the hell they are and why they formed.
So I think we're going to make this a 2-part because I think we need to hear Jung's theory.
Okay.
Of synchronicity. I'm going to call this synchronistic events because that's the term that Kirby uses. Mm-hmm. That's his first name. Dr. Surprise uses. But I want to hear what Jung thinks because it's obviously going to be very different because Jung's not going to go into any of this stuff. So I think he's probably going to come from a psychological perspective.
Sure.
And probably it's going to have to do with the universal forms, I'm going to guess.
Oh man, we're going to get so much. If there's an episode that we've ever done that will lead to a whole shitload of discussion and criticism, it's going to be this one.
So then this would be the first episode where we actually live up to our description?
Absolutely. I mean, there are going to be people, like, especially physicists. The problem with a lot of this stuff is that it's still, so much of it is still pure theory, that even if you wanted to, you couldn't prove the existence of these forces in the universe, nor can you define their mechanics.
Right. And to be clear, once again, our job is not to educate. Our job, the job that we've put forth with this show is just to make you think. So if we got it all wrong and you're thinking about it right now because you actually know all of the shit better than we do, awesome. I succeeded.
Yeah, but you know what, though? How can you possibly know all of this shit? And that's the part of it that
the
really
theory's better.
Yeah. Oh, sure. Yeah. But it's all entirely theoretical. What if we're all wrong and it's way dumber than this?
Oh, totally. But what I mean is my explanation of the theory, which, number one, I'm getting them from Dr. Kirby and not from someone who's actually a scientist in that field.
Sure.
I could explain it all completely wrong, but it was still an interesting discussion. And that's the point of the show. Yeah. And it's to get nerdy and it's to get weird and it's to get into the sticky, when shit gets sticky on the show, where Lam and I are at friction points like we were at the beginning, that's when it gets good.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree.
Because
then we have to justify to each other why our points are right.
Well, it's like what I said in the episode with Tom. If you want to understand something, one of the best ways to understand something is to have a talk with somebody. And I don't mean like always an amiable talk. The talk with tugs and difficulty and all that, because me explaining something and somebody not getting it and having to re-explain it, because the more times I re-explain it in different ways, the more I understand it. So if you guys would like to help support this show, you can become a patron by going over to patreon.com/Holy Productions, where you can hear, among other things, the first 30 minutes of this conversation or so that Lam and I had before we even started. It had nothing to do with this. I think we talked mostly about true crime, didn't we?
Yep, we did.
Yeah, we talked mostly about true crime because I have a new blog on the website. It's called Further Questions Blotter, as in crime blotter. and then just writing about true crime stuff on there. So I'm playing around with it. True crime's always been a passion of mine. I'm finally exercising it. So you guys, if you want to check that out, you can go to hoyfulproductions.com/blotter. That's BLOTTER. And you can follow further questions on Instagram and Twitter, further QST. Guess what? Twitter, I could put further question, but the S was too many for the name. So I went with QST because it was easier to say. Further QST. And Lam, where can they find you?
On Instagram at The Vacant Room. I'm also on Twitter at The Vacant Room as well. Yep, that's me.
And if you guys like this episode, you're listening to Overcast, hit the star now. I took away the thing where the money thing shows up. The link is still there to go to support us in the episode notes, but now the star is everywhere. You don't have that little money symbol, which is just a pain in the ass, I think.
Yeah.
So it's really easy for you to hit that star right now. Share this episode with a friend. Use that square with the arrow in it and go, boom, send it over and say, listen to this. And then rate and review us on Apple Podcasts and follow the show on Instagram and Twitter, Random Badassery, all one word. You can also follow Latte, who is mildly awake over there. And his Instagram is Latte Like the Drink, which is, of course, all one word. And if you go over to the blotter, make sure you check out the most recent piece called Cases That Haunt Us, where I talk about Richard Hauptmann, Zodiac, and Albert DeSalvo. And I'm bringing back a feature for the end of this, Lam. I've been doing it with guests. It started with you. I don't know why we stopped doing it. So, words of wisdom?
Oh. Wow. I love that you catch me off guard with these things. I didn't think you could catch me off guard anymore. Words of wisdom. Holy shit. Be brave enough to let go of who you think you should be.
Bye-bye, babies.
Bye.